Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to attempt to make a remix of DJ Seduction's classic from '91, Hardcore Heaven. Now obviously this is going to be a totally unofficial remix. I haven't got permission from Seduction or any of the labels that release the music or have the licenses to the music. It's really just a way for me to show off the processes that I go through when I'm making some hardcore. I just felt that this was going to be a nice way to make the video relatable. Hopefully at the end of this we'll get a nice remix of Hardcore Heaven, but if not, maybe you'll have learned something anyway. Okay, so with all that being said, let's get into it. So the first step is going to be to drag all three of the versions of Hardcore Heaven into the timeline in Ableton. When dragging all three tracks into Ableton, if you hold down the Control key on the keyboard in Windows, it will drag each track onto its own audio track in Ableton. If you don't hold down Control when you drag all three into Ableton, they will all go onto the same audio track adjacent to each other. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is to set the tempo of the project to 135 beats per minute. We can do that by clicking up here where it says 120 by default and just typing in 135. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we are going to chop these three WAVs up into the samples that we want to keep and use in this track. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm going through each WAV and just finding the samples that I want to keep. You highlight the part that you want to sample and then you press Ctrl and E on the keyboard and that will split it from the rest of the audio clip. So rather than make you watch me do all of that, I'm going to fast forward through this and I'll show you what we've got after I finish chopping all of the samples. So before I show you the samples, I'm going to quickly do some housekeeping and I'm going to take these duplicates of the tracks that I originally imported and I'm going to move them to the top of the timeline so that they're out of the way, but we can use them later for reference when we're writing the remix. We shall deselect these three tracks by clicking on their numbers, which I'll highlight here on the screen, and that means that they won't play when we're auditioning the other samples. There was a couple of sounds that I couldn't sample very easily from any of the mixes of Hardcore Heaven, so I had to go and look up their sources. Now one of them was from MCJJ and Devious D's Drive You Crazy. Another one was from Dragonfly Visions of Rage. One of the vocal samples was from Peach Boys Life Is Something Special. And the Here It Comes sample I actually had from a sample CD. I don't remember which one, but I had it on disc, so I just grabbed it. Here it comes. And then finally we have a vocal sample that was in one of the remixes of Hardcore Heaven, and I found that on Data File 1. Data File 1, if you don't already know, is a sample CD from the early 90s that was heavily used and abused by most artists back in the day. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to grab the main stab sound from Hardcore Heaven, the one that we all recognise as being from that main riff, and then I'm going to put it into the sampler just to show you how I do it, and then after that I will just do all of the other samples in the background so that they're done, because otherwise it's going to be a long and very repetitive process of me putting samples in the sampler when if you've seen it once you've seen them all really. And then after that I will get on with playing the main riff from Hardcore Heaven and I'll show that in the MIDI clip and how I kind of work the riff out. Okay, so starting with the stab, we're going to grab it and move it to an empty part of the timeline, and then we'll zoom in a little bit and then double click on the clip and we'll move the starting point of the sample to just where the stab starts and then we'll use the gain control to make the sample play louder. Then we'll right click on the clip and choose consolidate. Then we'll right click on the audio track and we'll choose insert MIDI track. Now with the MIDI track selected, scroll over to the left to the instruments menu and then click on sampler and drag it down to the effect strip at the bottom of the screen. Then drag and drop the sample onto the sampler. Next we're going to create an empty MIDI clip by selecting 2 bars on the timeline on the MIDI track and then right clicking and choosing insert MIDI clip. If the piano roll doesn't immediately open, then double click on the MIDI clip and it will reveal itself. At this point, now that you can see the piano roll, you can start playing in notes and trying to work out your riff. What I usually do if I'm replaying a riff or recreating someone else's riff is I will move the MIDI clip so that it lines up with the riff that I'm trying to recreate. That's why we've got the original WAVs up at the top there, and then make it loop so that I can replay the notes in time with the original. So that's what you're going to see me doing here. Okay, so first of all I play the original loop that I've sampled, then I zoom in on the timeline to try and tidy it up a little bit. And then I consolidate this into a new clip. And then I use warp markers to line up the hits onto the grid because they're just slightly off at this point. Just to tidy the markers up, because we're going to use the warp markers to set the point where all of the transients are in order to get each individual hit from start to finish, and then we can use those to slice up the break into its individual parts and then recreate the rest of the bar of the loop. And this is because the sample that we took from the original didn't have a whole bar of the drums clean. I think there was a deck stop at the end of it, so I had to take that off and just keep what was remaining. But fortunately there was enough of the hits there that we could reconstruct the missing part of the loop. So now I select a bar's worth of the timeline, which includes the part of the bar that we've got of the drums, and then I loop it so that I can create the rest of the bar. And now, because all of the hits line up on the grid properly, I can easily just edit the audio clip by copying and pasting the parts that I need to flesh out the remaining missing part of the bar. And so because I want to work with MIDI rather than audio, I will consolidate this new bar into a new file, and then I'll redo all of the warp markers so that we have the whole bar's worth of warp markers in place, which means that we can slice the whole bar into its individual parts and use that as MIDI. At this point, I remembered that I hadn't put in the warp marker for the end of the last slice, and it's important that you do this when you're using the Slice to MIDI tool, because if you don't, what will happen is the last slice of the bar just ends up being a tiny little blip on your MIDI clip, and you end up having to delete it anyway. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to right click on the audio clip with all of the warp markers in it, and we're going to choose Slice to New MIDI Track. Then in the options of the Slice to New MIDI Track window, we're going to change Transient to Warp Marker, and then we're going to click OK. And what Ableton's going to do is it's going to create a new MIDI track, and then it's going to put a drum rack on it. It's going to assign each pad of the drum rack with each drum hit that we've defined as being between one warp marker and the next. And then it's also going to generate the pattern of the drums inside of a MIDI clip on the MIDI track. Now if you double click on the MIDI clip, it'll open up on the piano roll and it will show you all of the notes that it generated in the pattern. At this point you can then move them around, adjust the note length, change the velocity, all those kind of things, all from within the MIDI clip. Next up, we're going to create an ALC file of your break. Now to do this, you need to enable the second window so that you can see the mixer. Now above the mixer on that same screen, you can see like a grid. Now what you want to do is you want to drag the MIDI clip from the arrangement view onto the grid above the mixer. So the next thing you want to do is to click on your library. If you don't know where that is, it's under Places on the left hand side of the Ableton window. Now you can create yourself a folder in there, say call it breaks for example. Mine already exists, so I won't be creating one. And then you want to drag your MIDI clip over from the right hand side screen above the mixer and drag it all the way to the left into the breaks folder inside of your library. When you drop the file inside of the library, you will get prompted to name it. The great thing about ALC files is that not only does it contain the MIDI pattern, it also contains all of the slices on the drum rack that you've created. And if you've added any processing to the track that it's on in the arrangement view, it will also keep that as well. Which means you can then drag that into a new project at a later date and it will be exactly as you've just saved it. All your slices, the MIDI pattern ready to go, and any processing that you've got on it. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is to recreate the call and response of the beeps and the Visions of Rage stabs for the intro. None of the intros of the other versions of Hardcore Heaven start with that, so that's what I want to do with mine. Now as you can see here with the Visions of Rage sample, I had to warp it into time so that it matched up with the beats on the grid. The next element I want to add to the track is the vocal from data file 1, that short vocal stab. And then of course just before the drums kick in, we're going to have the deck stop followed closely by the Here Comes sample. Here it comes. So the reason I didn't import those samples into the sampler is simply that it was easy enough to just edit them on the timeline. They only needed warping. I don't need to play them up and down notes on the keyboard, so it's really pointless putting them into the sampler. Okay, so next is the drums, and as you can see here, I've got two different clips of the drums posted up at the same time. I often get asked what's the significance of the different colours of the clips when I'm doing drums, or in fact any elements on my timeline. And in a nutshell, I just use the different colours to signify that I've changed the pattern in some way. So I might have done a drum edit where I've cut out the last beat's worth of kick drums and hi-hats just to allow some space for a vocal sample to play in there or something like that. Using different coloured clips in this way allows for a much easier experience when doing wholesale changes to your timeline, simply because you can see all of your variations in one go, and it makes it a lot easier to copy and paste a whole chunk of your track, such as the drums for example, from one part of your track to another while you're editing and adding in new riffs. Now in the case of these drums, you can see that I replayed slice 1 on every beat because it's a kick drum. And so the difference between the two different coloured clips is that there's a variation in the hi-hat at the end of the bar. Now it is a very, very subtle change, just a very small hi-hat change at the end of the bar, but any kind of difference makes it more interesting. And if you look closely at the MIDI pattern, you'll probably notice that I've shortened all of the notes. And this is because each of the warp markers probably wasn't on the 0 crossing. And so each slice of the drum break that we used probably now has a click at the end of each slice because it's the start of the next slice. And so I'd cut down the note length of each of the slices so that we lose that clip. You could fix this by changing the release timing on each slice, but I just find it a lot easier to do it this way instead. When I added in the second break, I made a couple of different variations. So the first one is literally just a loop of some hi-hats. The next instance of the break, it plays straight. And then the second variation of that is that I've put slice 1 on the beat, so it's another 4/4. The next drum element that I added was a 909 core kit from Ableton. I only used a closed hat and an open hi-hat from that drum kit and just drew in a pattern that made sense with the other drums that were going on in the tune. The final element as far as the drums is concerned is the clap that we sampled out of one of the versions of Hardcore Heaven. On its own it doesn't really do much, but when you add it to the 909 core kit and the other two breaks, it does make quite a big difference, especially with regards to the original sound of tunes that were coming out on Impact back in the day. Okay, moving back to the intro, I decided that I wanted to use the low stab and make a riff that was going to have some impact on the introduction. I also then played in the bass riff to match it. And here it is with the bass. So let's talk about the bass. It's an 808 sample that wasn't recorded at C, so when I imported it into the sampler, I had to transpose it down a note so that its root note is a B rather than a C, and then from there I can play the riff to match the stabs as is required. Now the first breakdown is obviously going to contain that stab that we know as being Hardcore Heaven. And I'm also going to play the original riff, not the remix riff that you heard me playing earlier in this video. Now in order to make my first breakdown different from the original, despite playing the original riff, I'm going to use the ad-lib from Peach Boys' Life is Something Special over the top of the stab riff, which I don't recall being done in any of the original versions. So in order to get the Peach Boys vocal to sound right, I had to warp some of the changes in the vocal to play at the right time. Once I'd done all the warping and all of the changes to the vocal were playing at the right time, it was time to move on to the automation of the echo. So seeing as I only needed the very last part of the vocal to echo, it made sense to just automate the delay or the echo device to turn on at the point that I needed it to come on, and then turn off before the next vocal played. And in Ableton it's easy enough to just automate that. So you press the A key on the keyboard to reveal the automation lanes, and then you can simply draw in the thing that you need to automate. Another way to reveal the automation is simply to right click on the control that you want to automate and then select Show Automation. So you can see that the device, which is the delay unit, it turns on when the line on the automation goes up and then turns off when the line comes back down again. And as for the settings of the delay, I'll go into that later with all of the other processing. So the next sample that I used in the track was the loop from MCJJ and Devious D's Drive You Crazy. Now this needed a lot of warping, and it needed to be pitched down a couple of semitones in order to be in tune with the rest of the track. The next major part of the tune was another breakdown, and this time it was a chance to use one of the other stabs that isn't so prominent in any of the hardcore heavens, or at least not that I remember anyway, and do something totally creative and new and original for this remix. So next up we returned to the low stab and made the riff a little bit more intricate because it's a bit further on in the tune, and then we also played the Peach Boys vocal over the top just like we did in the first breakdown. The next section of the tune is a breakdown, and it features the piano that was in the remix of Hardcore Heaven. Now I simply just used the loop of the piano. I did have to do some warping with the warp markers just to get the piano to play nice and tight to the grid, and this time I coupled it with the female vocal stab. After the piano section, I had to replay the riff that followed it in the remix. Doesn't seem very remixy, I know, but it's just so natural to hear it straight after the piano that I couldn't hear myself doing the remix any other way. So here's the riff. And so finally we make it to the last breakdown of the track. It features the stab riff that you saw me playing earlier in the video, the one where I was working out the notes, and it is coupled with the vocal from the Peach Boys, which plays over the top, and I believe that makes it unique from the other versions we know from the past. Alright, I'm going to stop this video here. I'm going to move all of the processing, the mixdown stuff, all of the effects, why I've done the effects the way that I've done them, all of that sort of stuff. I'm going to move that to another video, which we'll just call part 2, and then I'll reveal the track in part 2 as well. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and keep them peeled for part 2.